Hey LibGuide authors, it's me again, here to talk to you a little bit more about alt tags for images, specifically how to add an empty alt tag to decorative images, because sometimes you need to do that. So in a previous video where I talked about what to do when alt tags are missing, I mentioned that every image needs something called an alt tag, which is a piece of code embedded in the image that typically also includes something called alternative text. And the purpose of the alternative text is to describe the image or the function of the image for someone who is visually impaired and is using some kind of screen reader. And I also mentioned that there's actually quite an art to determining the most appropriate alternative text for an image. I certainly don't pretend to be any kind of expert on this because it can sometimes be a real challenge. It's not always as straightforward as you might think, and there are a lot of variables involved. Now, when you're looking at a web page, like this LibGuide, for example, you can't see what the alternative text is for each image because it's behind the scenes, embedded in the code. But as I also mentioned in the previous video, if you have a LibGuide and you use the Wave tool to run an accessibility evaluation, which I'm going to do right now by clicking on the little Wave browser extension up here, it will display for you all of the alternative text that you've got going on for all of the images in the page you're looking at. So you can check to see if any of it needs any adjustment. So let's look at a few examples. Here's a box called Florida Wildlife, and the Wave tool is telling me that the alt tag for this picture of the manatee contains the alternative text manatee. And in my non-expert opinion, that seems pretty appropriate to me. I think this is one of those examples where it actually is pretty straightforward. So I think with this one, we're okay. And the same goes for this picture of the great blue heron, because the alternative text here is great blue heron. Now this next example is a picture of a coffee cup in a box called Coffee and Health. This is an image that is purely decorative. This image serves no purpose whatsoever other than just to make this text look a little less boring. In the context of this box, it doesn't convey anything informative. In a different context it might, but in this one it doesn't. It's just a decoration. Now for this image, the Wave tool is telling me that the alt tag contains the alternative text cup of coffee. And that sounds logical, but really when you have a purely decorative image, the alt tag should be empty. The tag needs to be there as part of the code, but it shouldn't contain any alternative text because you don't want to waste a visually impaired person's time by forcing them to listen to a screen reader describing images that for them serve no purpose. So an empty alt tag, which is also called a null alt tag, tells the screen reader to just skip over that image. So especially if it's a page where there are a lot of decorative images, it saves the user a lot of time. So in a minute we're going to go in and edit our guide, and we're going to want to take this alternative text out of this alt tag. So let's hold that thought for a second and scroll down a bit more. All right, now here is a situation where we're getting a Wave error. There's a red flag here because this image has no alt tag at all, not even an inappropriate one, not even an empty one. And in the previous video, I showed you how to add an alt tag to an image that doesn't have one by adding alternative text. But what if this were just a purely decorative image, which in this case it is, and you need to add an alt tag that doesn't contain any alternative text? How would you do that? Well, let's exit the Wave evaluation by refreshing our screen. And now I want to go into edit mode for my guide. Now here's the picture of the coffee cup that has the alt tag with cup of coffee as the alternative text. But what we really need is for this alt tag to be empty. So this one's pretty easy to fix. We're just going to go in to edit this. And then we're going to right-click the image and select Image Properties. And here where it says Alternative Text Cup of Coffee, we're just going to remove the words cup of coffee and leave this field blank. So now what we're left with is a purely decorative image with an alt tag that is empty, which is what we want. Now, here's the decorative image that doesn't have any alt tag at all. So it popped up as a wave error. So we need to add an alt tag and we want it to be empty. So let's go into edit this box and right click on the image and select image properties. Now, if I wanted to add an alt tag that had some alternative text in it, I'd just type in the alternative text. And in doing that, I'd be doing two things at once. I'd be adding the alt tag and the alternative text. But how do I add an empty alt tag? In this case, I can't just leave this alternative text field blank because then the image still wouldn't have an alt tag. So the question is, how do you add an alt tag to an image that doesn't already have one without also adding alternative text? Now, there are people who would suggest, and I'm going to tell you why I'm not in love with this suggestion, but they'll tell you just type a space here. And then that will add the alt tag without alternative text. But I got to tell you, my OCD is not happy with that solution because in my mind, if you're adding an alt tag with a space in it, that's not an empty alt tag. It's an alt tag with a space in it, if you want to split hairs. And the wave tool agrees with me because if you type a space in here and then you run this through the wave tool again, you won't get the error anymore that says missing alt tag, but you might get an alert that says something like suspicious alternative text. So what are we going to do here? Well, I hate to tell you this, but to add an empty alt tag to an image that doesn't already have some kind of alt tag, you have to get down and dirty with the code and go into the code for this image and add the tag manually. And some people aren't as comfortable with that as others, which is understandable. So what we need here is a little hack to help us painlessly get this done. So right here where it says alternative text, instead of a space, I'm going to type in some meaningless but easy to spot text. And what I usually like to type in is something like a string of uppercase Z's. So Z, 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 like that. So what I've done is I've added the alt tag for this image, and the Z's are going to make it easier for me to find it in the code so I can then go in and make it empty. So now I'm going to click the source button to see the code, and I'm going to scan through it until I see the ZZZZ. And here it is. See? Here's the alt tag I just added to the image in question, where it says alt equals, and then the Z's in quotation marks. Now all I have to do to turn this into an empty alt tag is remove the Z's. Just take them all out. Now I do want to be sure to leave the quotation marks. I want it to say alt equals quote, quote, with no text or spaces in between the quotes. That's what an empty alt tag is supposed to look like. And now I want to run the wave again. And remember, you want to be in preview mode, not edit mode, if you want to ride the wave. So click the eyeball in the upper right corner. And now I'll click the wave icon up here. And see? No errors, no alerts for this image, just a green icon that tells me I have an alt tag, and that alt tag is empty. And in this case, that's exactly what I want. Except now for some reason I want some coffee. I hear it's good for you. So I'm going to go get some. All right, see ya.